Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ramadan Kareem, dear viewers of the World Muslim Community Council, welcome to our series of the Muslim achievers and contributors for this program. Today, we are honored to invite Dr. Mansa King, visiting associate professor of American University Sharjah, and as well as associate professor of sociology at Morehouse College. Dr. Bilal, our brother, had earned PhD and MA in sociology from the famous Johns Hopkins University in the USA, and he also has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology with minor in Mathematics from Howard University. So very versatile background, as you see. And besides his academic professional life, Bilal has also worked as a diversity consultant, community organizer, violence prevention analyst, education consultant, teaching assistant, research assistant, etc. And more so today, we will hear from him, his experience and his spiritual path and his achievement after finding the peace with Islam, and how he understands his faith and his life and his community. So hopefully today's session with him will hear from him his stories, his journey, and his perspective and insight to benefit more Muslim brothers and sisters worldwide in this holy month of Ramadan. Now let's have a brother Mansa Bilal to share his stories and insights. Brother.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ramadan Mubarak, everyone. Thank you so much, Brother Shaljin. So I think I could start the story, as all stories begin, with my background. And what I mean by background, ancestrally, where I was, sort of my trajectory and how it makes sense, even from the beginning. What you have in my situation is a particular population of African descended people in North America, often called African American and Black American. But because now we have so many different groups from African backgrounds in the US, we like to use Sherman Jackson's Black American, capital B, lowercase a, compound word, to be very distinct about the background for those of us whose families have been in the United States of America through the slavery experience, chattel race-based slavery, a very particular rare kind of slavery, and through Jim Crow, the period after the slavery period that was in many ways an attempt to recreate the slavery society that had been ended. And so coming from that background, my parents, as recently as the 1960s, were Southerners. They were born in the South in the 1950s, which is during the period of Jim Crow segregation, as we call it in the United States. If you think of South African apartheid, this is a very similar kind of system. But during their teenage years, the laws that supported that system were abolished. And so you begin to see in my family line, even at that time, some changes in how people are dealing with faith, how people are dealing with employment and education, and family trajectories will change for some and not for others. So that's kind of the roots in the beginning. Both of my parents actually, because in that time, doors were more opening than closing for Black Americans. So both of my parents actually attended college, but they attended college from a perspective of you go to school, you get a job, a better paying job than your parents had, and school doesn't doesn't really change you much. And I'm making this point because when I get to my own life at that stage, it's going to be a different story to some degree, and it's going to matter. But so as my parents followed the old traditions, so they got married young. My father was 21, my mother was 18. He was just about to graduate from Arkansas State University and join the United States Army. He was an officer immediately after college. And my first sibling, my eldest sibling, my sister, was born before they even left, before he joined the Army. And my brother was born in Hawaii, the same place that Barack Obama was actually born, because my parents were stationed there when my father did his time in the early 1970s. So then we get to the time of my birth, right? I was born the year after my family left Hawaii, and my father had taken a job in corporate America in Chicago, Illinois, or actually just slightly north of Chicago, Illinois. So I was actually born, but we lived way on the south side. I was born in a town called Harvey, Illinois, which today you can't tell the difference. If you're driving from Harvey into Chicago, it's just all the south side, they would say. But back in those days, Harvey was a small town south of Chicago. However, I have no memories of not just Chicagoland, but no memories even of Illinois. We moved when I was slightly older than 1 year old, I think if the chronology is correct, to Memphis, Tennessee. And so we're now back in the South, where my family's family, my ancestry has been for hundreds of years. And so my first memories in life are in a still segregated Black neighborhood in Memphis, Tennessee. By that point, segregation is not the law of the land, but institutions have not been undone or undermined. And so you still find the majority of Black Americans living separate neighborhoods from white Americans. And back then, all other groups as well. The kind of diversity that you'll see today in the United States in majority white neighborhoods was not happening. So I was born in segregated Black America, just what we call de jure segregation. My first 5 years of life in the kind of Black neighborhood that is harder and harder to find as you move from the 1970s into the 1980s. What kind of neighborhood is that? It was a class heterogeneous neighborhood. There were people who made a good amount of money, people who had some education and had professional jobs. There were people who had, working class jobs and who could still not only pay their bills, but pay their bills, take care of their families, go on vacation, right? Decent working class jobs. And there were people who were low income as well, may not always be able to pay all of the bills. So my earliest memories are with Black American kids from all kinds of class backgrounds, but all Black American. The ethnic diversity was not there. And there was, until I was 4 years old, there was no racial diversity in my neighborhood. When I was 4 years old, way down at the end of, well, not even the end of the block. So our neighborhood was close to the Mississippi River. And so down at the park on the Mississippi River, a white family bought some old government buildings. And the husband and wife ran a metalworks museum. And their children were about my age and my older brother's age. My older brother is 4 years older than me. And so we started playing with Peter and Jed. I had my first white friends. This is the beginning of the diversity experience in my life, which it's going to continue to diversify. But after 1 year of kind of the neighborhood changing because a white family moved in, which if you even know anything about the United States of America, that's an unusual direction. Typically, white families move out of where Black families are moving in to. But we moved to another state, the state of Missouri, and into another city, the city of St. Louis. Well, actually, the metropolitan area of St. Louis, but we moved to St. Charles, Missouri, which is a small town outside of St. Charles. Here, we moved into a totally opposite neighborhood, right? So I'm 5 years old. All I've known is majority, overwhelmingly Black American neighborhood culture and life. And then we moved into a small white town where I think even still to this day, St. Charles is about 8% Black, with very little other kind of diversity present. To drive home the point, when we arrived, my brother and sister were the only Black kids in school, in the elementary school that they attended. I was still in preschool, but when I started elementary school, when I started kindergarten, 1 year after we arrived there, the only other Black kids in school were my siblings, and then they graduated into middle school. So I was from first grade through fifth grade, the only Black kid in school. This is an unusual experience for my cohort of Black Americans. Isn't it? I'm not completely alone, but especially in the early 1980s, this was not something that happened very often, and it set me on a particular trajectory. One, because I was not being racially socialized by my school or my neighborhood environment. What's powerful about this, when you think about how your parents might have taught you ethnicity, how your ethnic identity, your culture, how you should think of your people, and how you should read the behavior of other people. Oftentimes, for other groups, right, in the United States, there won't be a neighborhood complement. It will be what your parents taught you, and maybe a couple of other families from your background. Well, we had the rare experience, again, for Black Americans, for my parents to be the overwhelming influence on how I would think about what it means to be Black American for the early years. And then we'll talk about what happens as I begin to become a teenager, and I begin to do what many teenagers do, and you find ways to look beyond your parents. But so those years from age 5 to 12, very important time period. I was in a town where all of the kids were extremely competitive about their academics. Well, obviously there's always the one or two exceptions, but the culture of schooling that I experienced was one where doing well in school was something you bragged about. We used to take standardized tests. I'll never forget the name of it, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, at the end of every school year. And it would tell you what grade level you were performing at, right? If you're in the third grade and you're performing at fifth grade level in reading, that was something that you could, kind of speak about with pride amongst your peers, unless your peers were reading at a seventh grade level, in which case you would, right, stay quiet. You didn't want anyone to know you're reading below their level, right? You're reading above your level grade-wise, but you're not reading at your peers' level, so you don't boast about it. And so this is how it went every year. And I stayed, as I said, I was the only Black kid. And at home, right, I'm learning Black American culture from my parents in the form of, for example, jazz music, right? This music that went all around the world, that began in Black America, that became slowly accepted in the rest of parts of the United States. It's a musical form of excellence, right? Similar to that educational experience that I was undergoing. But I didn't learn about it in an explicit, you're Black American, jazz is your heritage, this is your music, make sure you know it, here are the different branches and the star performers. No, it was just every Sunday morning, we had family breakfast, and my parents would put on Earl Klug and George Benson and Al Jarreau and a number of other jazz musicians whose music is still classic to this day. We watched, films that, again, it wasn't an explicit, hey, we're going to watch Roots because you're Black. It was, Roots is on, we're all watching it. The Color Purple is on, we're all watching it. Coming to America, right? Eddie Murphy films and all this sort of thing. So that was how my parents exposed me. And there were books around the house. I read The Color Purple before I watched The Color Purple. I wish I had read Roots before I watched Roots, but slightly different discussion. And so this is important. I'm setting the foundation because at age 12, we moved again. When I was 12 years old, we moved again. We stayed in the state of Missouri, but we moved to the city of Kansas City. And Kansas City, this is now 1986. Kansas City in 1986 was just beginning to experience the crack epidemic. And this time we did not move to the suburbs. We didn't move to a small town. We moved into a majority Black environment. The city government of Kansas City was attempting what we call Black gentrification, which is they were trying to create a set of policies that would facilitate a Black middle class expansion within the city. And so we moved into I think at that time it was 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 blocks of Black middle class housing. All of our immediate neighbors, the parents were professionals. They were well-paid people, mostly college graduates. There was a state representative whose house was on top of the hill. It was a very fancy house. But outside of those 4 or 5 blocks, we were again we were surrounded by what I had not experienced before, which was an overwhelmingly low-income Black population. And so here, all of these years up until 12 years old, sort of what I've learned about being Black, how to function as a young Black man in America is now at odds with what I'm seeing in my surroundings. Once I leave the neighborhood, once I go to school, there are just large numbers of people who do not understand America the way I understood America, who do not understand their place in the country from a jazz excellence, school performance matters perspective. Some of them did, yes, but many of them were very disconnected from these kinds of institutions. And so I began around the age of 12, once we moved to Kansas City, my journey into the social sciences, because I had to try to understand why folks approached life the way that they approached life. And it was so very different from how I approached life. And yet the racial ideology of the time was that we're all the same people. And so we should, we should see things the same. We should have the same culture. We should have the same sort of aspirations, which I was very clear we did not. And so by the second year of my time in Kansas City, I had even begun to be affected by what was beyond my house, what was beyond my neighborhood, but what was, very much so in my schools, and increasingly was becoming part of the music. Hip hop was 10 years old or so. By 1986, actually, it was 12 years old. And so I had begun to actually listen to hip hop music, same thing. For me, there was a level of analysis of understanding, but there was also, I was becoming a teenager. And so I was relating to some of the teenage critique of what the adults just don't understand, because my parents grew up in Black America, but they didn't grow up in the ghettos of Kansas City. They grew up in big city ghettos. And so there were behaviors that I would encounter, not just in school, but when I left school, walking home or catching the bus or hanging out at the mall, I was seeing things that people were doing and valuing, and even I would say getting away with, that when I would come home and my parents would try to explain, what people do and why they do it to me, I realized that there were entire groups of people out here that my parents just didn't understand, or didn't even know really that those people had now come into a place of respect in our community, whereas previously they were not respected widely. They only had respect in their own circles. So I'm starting to gain street knowledge as a way of understanding the world, and it's coexisting, right, with this academic schooling knowledge. So this becomes an important time in my life. It's only 3 years. We lived in Kansas City, Missouri from 1987 to 1990. But I think it was a crucially important time in my life. It's during that time period that I literally came 10 minutes away from going to jail. A decision as simple as getting in a car or getting out of a car with a guy that I knew from the larger neighborhood, who had decided just for kicks to steal a car. And he stopped along the way, picked up me and my brother, and we're riding in the car. And a couple of seconds later, something in my mind said, I should get out of this car. And so I said, can you stop the car, man? Let's get out. So, we got out of the car, and sure enough, 10 minutes later, James got picked up by the police. James went to jail, and had we stayed in that car, we would have gone to jail with James. And so, moments like that, where if you think of the broad narratives, there are stories about neighborhoods like, the broader neighborhood where I lived, and there are stories about kids who walked on the streets that I walked on. I would have become someone who easily would start to look like I was just another statistic, as they might say, 10 minutes away, 10-minute decision. But, and my grades had slipped from the A's that I always used to make, coming from that academically competitive environment that I once lived in, to starting to make B's mostly. And I made my first C, which was actually, I hid that from my parents when that was a report card that I said didn't come home, I think in the 7th grade. So this is, my point is that these years were a time where I was not learning a great deal in school. I wasn't learning a great deal of academic knowledge from school, but I was learning a great deal about the broader Black world that was emerging. That the Black middle class oriented world that I had always known was really not ready for. And that's going to become extremely relevant to my journey later. So we left Kansas City and moved back to Memphis, Tennessee. By that point, I had disconnected a bit from my Southern traditions. I think you could say I bought into kind of trying to be a little cool, and that meant that the South was slow and backwards. And so we moved back to Memphis, but my mind and spirit stayed in the urban North. I endured Memphis for about 3 years, another sort of racially, demographically unique environment. This time, I think my school was about 30 to 35% Black American. There were literally 2 Latinos. There were a couple of guys from a Mexican family. There were literally 2 Asians. There were a couple of girls from a Vietnamese family. There's actually a Korean Baptist church around the corner from my house. I don't know where their kids went to school from those families, or there just weren't any in my age range, but my high school had none of them. Everyone else was Black American or white American, pretty much from the South. That was my last 3 years of high school. But because I was disconnected from Southern culture by that point, to a degree, at least in my mind, and so I didn't fit into the social world, I was able to shift back into my sort of academic excellence. And this becomes really beneficial. I earned really good grades in high school. I participated in some college preparatory activities. I did a summer research program at what was then called Memphis State University, now University of Memphis. And when I started, getting letters from colleges and thinking about where I would go to college, long story short, I looked at maybe two predominantly white schools in the United States. St. Louis University, interestingly enough, a friend of mine now teaches there, Harvard University, and Morehouse College. I did not look at Howard University at all. I didn't know anything about Howard University, to put it more correctly. I was in a Southern space where Morehouse had much more sort of cachet. It was talked about. It was the school that Martin Luther King Jr. had graduated from. It was the school that Spike Lee had graduated from. There was a list of these illustrious alumni who were still shaking things up if they were alive, like Spike Lee. And so I was very interested in going to Morehouse College. I had the grades to get in. I had no concerns about that. I was not so certain about the scholarships. I had already kind of heard the word that Morehouse rarely gives full ride scholarships. They tend to take that what would be full ride money and divide it up so that they can help more young men a little bit instead of help just a few young men with a full ride. And Morehouse College is all men's college. It's the only historically Black all men's college in the United States of America. And I got accepted to Morehouse. For a backup plan, I applied to 2 local schools in case I couldn't figure out how to get the scholarship money, right? I applied to Memphis State University, which has now changed its name. It's now the University of Memphis. And I applied to a local liberal arts college, Rhodes College, which the idea of being at a liberal arts college even then had some appeal to me. But I really wanted to go to Morehouse, which is also a liberal arts college. And then late in the game, two things happened that changed the entire trajectory. One, I spoke to an Army recruiter. You know, I told you my father was in the U.S. Army back in the 70s. And so what I realized was, you know, I could pay for my college education at an expensive school like Morehouse with the benefits that are offered to someone who joins the United States, the Army in particular. And not long after I signed up for the U.S. Army Reserves to get access to those benefits, I found out about Howard University and how I could easily apply to Howard. And based on my PSAT score, the pre-Stanford SAT. SAT is one of the two major important college tests that you would take in the United States in order to qualify, in order to apply to schools. My PSAT scores had been pretty good. I needed to take the SAT. And if I scored well on the SAT, I would qualify for scholarship to Howard. So I did that. Took the SAT, applied to Howard, had been going to the what they call delayed entry program for the United States Army Reserve. I'd been going to drills for several months before I finally got word back. Not only had I been accepted to Howard University, I had a full ride scholarship. I'd been accepted to Morehouse College with a partial scholarship. Like any young man whose family can pay the bills but doesn't have, you know, 100,000 that it saves up every year to send you to college, well, 20, 30,000 a year back then. I went to Howard. I had not really learned much about Howard prior to then, as I said. I didn't know what was going to sort of greet me in Washington, D.C., but I knew that my tuition and my housing and my food would be paid, and I would take care of the rest however I had to. So I went to Howard University. Changed my life, completely changed my life, completely changed my outlook on the world. Howard University was a space where Blackness was global. Black Americans, yeah, we were there, but anyone who grew up like I grew up and walked into the space in Washington, D.C. on the campus of Howard University immediately had to rethink what Black people are, what Black people do, what Black people don't do, how Black people speak. Right? I'm there in school with Nigerians in large numbers, various other West African groups. I'm there with Jamaicans in large numbers, various other Caribbean groups. And so now my earlier attempts to sort of understand my, you know, nascent social science is very much shifting into, you know, I use the metaphor of a stick shift car, a manual car. You know, I shifted from third gear to fifth gear in just understanding Black people, Black world, and my religious journey, right? I haven't really mentioned my spiritual journey up to this point. As anyone who kind of knows Black America would know, that means I grew up in a Christian household. The vast majority of Black American families, especially the circa 1970s when I was born, are, you know, Protestant Christians. There's a significant minority of Catholics. There's a very vocal minority of Muslims. And the Muslims had made enough noise that I knew about the idea of Islam. I knew about Black Muslims, particularly the Nation of Islam. And this is an important point that I'm going to make here. I was a typical Black American kid then and now, in that if you said Muslim and Black American to me, I went mentally straight to the Nation of Islam, which at that time meant I went straight to Louis Farrakhan and his community. I knew nothing about the plethora of Quran and Sunnah oriented, traditionally Islamic Black American Muslim communities. Didn't know they existed, didn't know they had been around, you could say for 100 years if you want to get to the reawakening, but that literally the history of Muslims in the United States has in fact been Quran and Sunnah oriented people of African descent. I didn't know any of that, and that was denied to me is on one level kind of a testimony to just bad education system. Throughout the United States, no one learns this, generally speaking. So I arrived at Howard University to a place where, yes, the Nation of Islam had a voice. The Nation of Islam has a voice because it is the voice of Islam married to the Black freedom struggle. And so all Black Americans who cared about the future of Black Americans and how to get past the crack epidemic and the ghetto experience and deterioration of our culture, Islam, the idea of Islam as put forward by the Nation of Islam was one of the possible solutions. And it was also very much connected to Black nationalism. All of that permeated the hip hop music of the late 80s and early 90s. And so I was very quickly turned on to the possibility of, leaving my Christianity behind. All of the critiques of Christianity landed well with me. Oh, this was not even our people's religion until the experience of enslavement in the Americas. We had Muslims, we had traditional African religion devotees. We were not Protestant Christians in West Africa or Central Africa. And so why are we Protestant Christians now, given that was the religion of people who put us through race-based chattel slavery and still kind of aren't really willing to do much to kind of fix what they broke, if you will. That landed with me kind of well. And so the critique of Christianity led me to thinking about Islam. Then I bought a Quran. That was a mistake. Why was it a mistake? I didn't go sit with any Muslims, and I didn't find a Quran with footnotes. Now, someone with the background that I had, picking up a Quran with no footnotes, reading it without any people around to help, means that I made it to somewhere in the first 100 ayahs of Surah Al-Baqarah, and I put it down because it didn't make sense to me. I continued, however, to listen to, sort of those conversations about religion and spirituality. And in that place and in that time, Islam was loud, but so was traditional African religion. And particularly the iterations of traditional African religion that find their kind of core sets of teachings and practices in what's now southwestern Nigeria, call it Yoruba land, and the next neighboring country, Benin. And that would, in fact, shape my spiritual journey for the next 10 years, from age 18 to 28, very solidly. My spiritual journey was one in the framework of traditional African religions more than any other, and the Yoruba understandings and practices specifically, although that is a belief system that very easily allows other practices to come in. So at a certain point, I was meditating on chakras and doing yoga, but still very much grounded in West African Yoruba religion. But during that time, from age 18 to 28, this is also a very expansive time for me academically. As Dr. Chai mentioned, I finished my bachelor's degree in psychology. I was, even before I got to college, I'd already decided that I was going to pursue a PhD, and the goal was a PhD in psychology. I was going to finally understand this racial problem that America has. I was going to write the book that fixed it. That was my sort of naive 15, 16-year-old plan for my life. And I set about trying to do that. So after I finished undergraduate school, my bachelor's degree, I stayed in Washington, D.C. I worked in Georgetown at a think tank, American Institutes for Research, and gained a number of experiences and broadened my perspective in terms of sort of the role of the federal government. Right? When you're 18 to 22 years old in the United States, you tend to not think that the government and the president and these sorts of things matter. And I had heard many of those critiques and was a bit partial to them. But at age 22, I started working for an organization that opened my eyes to exactly how influential the United States government is, let alone state governments and local governments over the rest of the society. And so, this helped me as I moved into an understanding of race as something that has a lot to do with public policy, something that is probably not going to be fixed without due attention being paid to public policies, to laws, to judicial rulings, et cetera, and the deployment of the power, the coercive force of the government being also important. But I stayed in that think tank world long enough to sort of figure out that I didn't want to stay in psychology, that I wanted to move into sociology. And that would pose a particular set of challenges for me. But I did it. And when I did it, I went all the way. I applied to two schools, Johns Hopkins University and Howard University. If I had stayed at Howard, I would have been a psychologist. Going to Hopkins was for sociology. And when I was accepted into Johns Hopkins, I was accepted into a department that doesn't allow students in unless they're going to give them a full ride scholarship, just like I had for my bachelor's. So I went, and I went all the way. I was a professional student, full-time student. That was my work. My work was to understand on a deeper level, using the scholarship that preceded me and generating new scholarship to understand race better. And what that meant was that I started to understand the deep connections between how race, which is out of all of the ones that I can mention, ethnicity, religion, et cetera, right? It is the one that has almost been created out of thin air. Ethnicity organically emerges as people live together and solve the kinds of problems of human community and share language and space. Religion, right? Even if you understand it from a purely social way, religion, right, has always been with us. It's how we answer the big questions before anything like philosophy, and everywhere where what Western philosophy is doesn't come to bear on the problem. But race, completely constructed by humans in a very, very opportunistic way. And it's fundamentally not about what we say it's about. It's not about skin color. It's not about all these other things, right? Race is about power and the uses of power. It's about respect and who's going to get it and who's not. It's about wealth, who's going to be allowed to generate wealth, who's going to be blocked from it as much as possible. So, I'm learning these things in graduate school and study of sociology as I'm relearning world history. And increasingly, I'm understanding how race and religion have been deeply intertwined in the way that race was constructed in Western civilizations. The first racial problem that the West had was Jewish people. Jewish people as a religious group, but they were also rendered as an ethnic group, also rendered as a racial group. And this has been something that has affected the trajectory ever since. Not long after Jewish people are Europe's first racial problem, Al-Andalus gives rise to this beautiful civilization, and the Reconquista gives rise to a racialization of Muslims. There's this strange conglomeration. You see the historic references to a group called Saracens or Moors, and there's a whole sort of literature on that. But I was learning all of this as I'm learning about race. And so by the time I reached age 28, I told you 18 to 28 was sort of this deeply embedded in traditional African religion in a sort of unproblematic way. By the time I was 28 and 3 years into my graduate program, I sort of hit what I call a moral rock bottom in terms of sort of decision making. I was finding that traditional African religion, as I practiced it and understood it, wasn't giving me the moral anchor and compass that I needed. And so I started to search again. And initially that search just meant that I was going to sort of intensify my practice of the traditional African religion. So I went to finally find kind of a fixed community and start to get a teacher, a specific guide, fumbling about through that for the next 3 years or 2 years. I ended up identifying someone through my professional work as I was trying to find where I would teach for a year as I finished my PhD. The Hopkins arrangement was full ride for 5 years, and I needed another year. So I found myself at Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where the director of the African American Studies program was a surprise, Yoruba priest. And so I connected with him immediately. I took the job, and not even a year, I guess exactly 1 year later, he and the group of people around him, it was about 5 other guys that I had become also part of as we were working, is a group of Black men of different religious identities and understandings, all working on masculinity, manhood, and trying to inform it and infuse it with spirituality. We went on a trip, an ancestral pilgrimage to Senegal and the Gambia in West Africa. And this was my first time going across the Atlantic. I had taken a trip or two in the Caribbean or even off the coast of the United States. Bermuda technically is not the Caribbean, which was where I spent the most amount of time. But going to Africa was an ancestral pilgrimage of the deepest importance for Black American. We have a mythologized view of Africa for the most part in Black American culture. And I was going to finally discard the myth and begin to get to know, Africa experientially. And this was very important. What I hadn't considered was that we were landing in a country that's 90+% Muslim, and Islam is deeply rooted in the culture of most of the peoples there. Particularly, we stayed longer in the Gambia than we did in Senegal. The Gambia's, these countries are ethnically very plural, but the Gambia's culture is marked by Mandinka culture, even more than the Wolof culture, which is more dominant in Senegal, north of the Casamance. And so Mandinkas have been Muslim for like 800-900 years at least. Deeply, deeply Muslim people. And I landed, I began to trying to understand what I'm seeing and why people do what they do and why they don't do what they do. And I'll just name one experience that was pivotal for me. We were standing in the marketplace. This is open markets, stalls. People have their wares very, very much sitting on tables and this sort of thing, or even hanging from the roof. The adhan is called, and I still didn't even know the word adhan at that point, which in that part of West Africa it would be called the azan, like it would be in much of South Asia. Half of the shop owners leave. They go to make wudu. They're going to go pray. And as I stood around and I looked and I saw vast stretches of this market where goods are just sitting out. And I was thinking to myself, I've lived in inner city, Kansas City, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Memphis, and I've seen inner city, Philadelphia, New York, all of these places in the United States where you can't leave your goods sitting out like this for however long it takes you to go and make wudu and salah without your goods growing legs, right? People know exactly what time you're going to leave the stuff unwatched. And so it just hit me. You have a PhD in sociology. You're considered a very educated person in your country, but you have no way of explaining what you're looking at right now. And so it sort of shifted the gears of my spiritual journey and my spiritual quest in such a way that immediately, actually, I'm sorry, I was 5 months before I'd finished my PhD at that point. This is because I went back a year later to continue to try to understand things. But as shortly after I finished my PhD, it was becoming really clear to me that my research was not going to be over what I had done my dissertation on in an explicit way, which was kind of fatherhood and families and race, right? I was going to be trying to understand religion in the world today, particularly Islam and African peoples. And I went back, I finished my PhD 5 months later. 5, 6, 7 months after that, I went back to Senegal and the Gambia for another shorter stay, actually. No, longer stay. I stayed for a month this time. The first time I only stayed for 10 or 12 days. I came back from that second trip, having taken my Shahada. It hit me while I was there. You're not going to understand Islam by reading books, just like you're not going to understand Africa by reading books. You're going to have to experience this. You're going to have to practice this. You're going to have to get to know this. I, at the time, actually thought that I was going to continue to practice traditional African religion, Yoruba religion, and just integrate the best of Islam into it. But the longer I practiced, the more it became clear everything I needed was in Islam. And so I found that the Orishas were no longer a necessity in my spiritual practice. Now, there are undoubtedly, as I came into Islam in Sufism, very Sufi infused understanding of this religion, which meant there was a connection between traditional African religion, sort of worldview, and the worldview of Islam as I've learned it. And that's not gone away. It's, to be 100% transparent, but it's also made it very possible for me to weave together this professional identity as a sociologist and a researcher. And anyone who's familiar with sociology knows that there's a strong sort of secularism, if not atheism, dimension to how many sociologists approach the discipline. But for me, that was never really an issue because that was just their view. And there's so much in sociology that I find marries, if you will, with my understanding of Islam and of religion and the way the world works. So when Allah talks about an ayat, that he will make their foul deeds fair seeming to them in the English translation, speaking about those who think, who are engaged in really bad behavior. Allah is like, I will make them think that it's good behavior. This is symbolic interactionism from a sociological perspective. It allows you to talk about, hey, I think it is exact. This is about spiritually, right? I understand that the subjective reality is also sort of, right, the result of Allah coloring things for people. And I'm being told my internet connection is unstable, so I don't know if my signal is coming through clearly right now. Excellent, thank you. And so we've reached the last stage of the story, and I'm right on time, about 1 hour in, where anyone who knows that Islam knows that marriage is half the religion. And all the way up through this story, I was an unmarried guy. Marriage was always something that I had a lot of questions about and a lot of critiques of, because growing up in the United States, particularly in the post-1960s era, less 70s, 80s, and beyond, the society has been made unfriendly to marriage, unhospitable to marriage. It's made marriage and children a very difficult proposition. And so, coming of age in that society, I couldn't figure out how you make marriage work and still, right, keep everything else functioning. But as I came into Islam, I came to the realization of walking in faith, having faith in Allah. And so I did get married the same summer that I took Shahada, which was also the same summer that I took a job. I accepted a position teaching sociology at Morehouse College, the same school that I had applied to as a young man coming out of high school. Different department though. And so I got married, but I rushed into it. It was an ill-advised marriage. I essentially, if I use a sports analogy, I had not been practicing, right? The skill set needed to sustain a marriage. I had been practicing being single. And so my first and my second marriage ended relatively quickly because I had absolutely no practice, right? As we used to say, coach says you'll play in the game exactly how you played in practice. And so if you haven't practiced at all, you're not going to do well when it's game time. But I did not give up on the marriage quest. And after making Hajj and after doing a study abroad to Ghana, I met my current wife. That was back in 2010. I'm sorry, we met in 2009, actually. First study abroad to Ghana. Did another study abroad to Ghana the next year, and we got married while I was there in 2010. And in 2011, she was finally able to move to the United States. 2012, I became a parent, a father, the first time, and since we have two other children in addition to the first one. So this is a journey, personal, spiritual, familial. As far as the academic work goes, I was essentially re-educating myself in understanding Islam. And so I did publish some work based on my sort of dissertation research. But what was much more important was starting to figure out how I could contribute to academic and public conversation and thinking that is engaging with these kinds of things that I've been talking about: race, religion, Islam, Black freedom struggle in many ways. So published some work on the family trajectory, but I was moving. And if you look at my published works, and if you look at my public talks even more, I did more talks than papers and chapters. I started slowly moving in this direction of doing race. I stepped back into race, even race without religion. I did a piece on racial reconciliation between Black and white America. At the same year, I think, I gave a very important talk for Phi Beta Kappa chapter at Eastern Illinois University on Africana Muslims. So I was weaving these together, race and religion, and sort of a sociological framing of the conversation. And by about 2017, I kind of saw clearly that the path forward in terms of my own research is around these questions of Black Americans, right? Particularly Black American children who are raised outside of the United States of America for at least part of their childhood, significant enough period of time that we might expect it to affect them. But I call this sort of this project the Transnational Black America Project, what happens to the children? Because the question is, what kind of Black Americans do you produce, right? I think back to my own experience where when I was in a context where my parents had a great deal more influence over what kind of Black American I was going to be becoming, I was on this really nice trajectory. But as I got older and as my community context, sort of school and beyond school, shifted, it really impacted me in ways that you don't want to ignore. And so, thinking about what that looks like for a kid who's not growing up in a place where there are these entire parts of town full of Black Americans who've been marginalized from good jobs, healthy community, good schools. What does that do? For the last year, my own children have been going to a private school here in Sharjah. Their classmates are mostly South Asian and Arab children, middle-class families. But I'm also, making sure to have conversations with them about what it means to be Black American. And so, what kind of person comes out of that experience? What is their connection to the, traditional Black American heritage, Black American culture? And there's a whole global dimension to it as well, that becomes relevant. So all of this is my current research. And I think it's going to be an increasingly important question. And I'm starting largely with children of Muslim families, because I've known a number of them over the last 15 years living in Atlanta, Georgia. Well, more than 15, what is this? 2022, if we start with I moved there in 2006. But actually, I met my first connection with these families in the Gambia in 2005. We were hosted by a young Gambian man whose wife was a Black American woman from Chicago. My story keeps coming full circle. This is another full circle moment. And they had already at that time, I think that their son was 2 years old. So when I moved to Atlanta in 2006, he was 3, I think he was 4 actually. So he was 4 years old. And I'm interacting with this young man, and I've known him now, virtually all of his life that he can remember. And by virtue of his connection to the Gambia through his father, and for a year that he got to live in the Gambia with his father, he's a different kid. He's not navigating the sort of minefield that being Black in America and growing up can be, without weapons. He has some tools, and those tools and those weapons come from his heritage, with a more direct connection to Africa, and his time spent living there, his connection to his father, living there with his father, and then coming back to the US and knowing that he wasn't just visiting an African country, he was visiting home. And he wasn't around some African people, he was around his people. And the stories like his that, have really piqued my curiosity and made me want to ask, what are the potential benefits of building centers, more centers. There actually are some, I'll save that for another time for a talk, but building centers for young Black American kids to be able to spend a year or two of those key developmental years, for example, would have been good for me between ages 13 and 15, maybe, to get out of the country and never make a C and never try to hide a report card from my parents, but instead be, experientially wrestling with what it means to be a Black American Muslim in Senegal or Morocco or the UAE, who knows? So that's kind of from the roots to the present, my story in about an hour.
Wow. So it's very legendary, in fact. And you going into this such details, and you meet all this unheard experience and stories for most of us. Even I think because we are not living your life and your experience, we had different trajectories. But I think because of Islam, we could gather on the similar phase, and also on this because of technology, we could gather on this similar platform to hear your stories and experiences. So especially those detailed and anecdotal stories are really touching, and you made the connections between the continents, from Africa to North America, even to the Middle East. Subhanallah. So before I conclude, I just want to ask you one more thing, if you could, just to it's kind of a summary, or kind of what would be the takeaways for global Muslims who are watching our show, for example, and as to understand what the meaning of being a Muslim in today's world. Yeah, because your research and your experience focus on your racial and life experience, but we maybe do a little bit of abstraction. Let's see today's world, or based on your experience and the world we live in, what would be the takeaway for being a Muslim today?
I think one of the really big takeaways is, as Muslims, we have to do a lot of work to understand those usually ethnic, right? Black Americans are a unique group because our racial experience is our ethnic experience, but understanding this ethnic trajectory that often is extremely important for understanding how a group of Muslims may normatively think about Islam and I construct Muslim identities that they teach their children. The Muslims are not well served by sort of assuming that the way that I understand Islam is the way that Islam is to be normatively, and any other person who claims to be Muslim who doesn't see it this way, right, is not well served by this. But really starting with a social scientific, if you will, symbolic interactionist perspective of let me get to understand how this Muslim understands Islam. And to the best of my and their ability, why that is, what is the sort of larger, not just from an individual, but group trajectory that really informs. So that way you're not just getting to know one person, right? That if you're able to get to know communities and different parts of those communities, there are always sub-communities within a community, that we stand a better chance of getting to know other Muslims, building, working relationships with Muslims of different backgrounds, if we have a good understanding of where they're coming from, what Islam means to them, why and how they practice it the way that they do, and what beliefs come, in addition to, if you will, or even coloring Quran and Hadith and other elements of the sort of super tradition. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. In fact, this really fit the missions and some action plans by the World Muslim Community Council, which patronized this event today. They are trying to feature the diversity and indigenous experiences of Muslim communities worldwide, whether they're from China, from Africa, from Europe, and from India. And each communities, ethnic community, racial communities, and national communities understand Islam with their diverse understanding. But we eventually reach to the a unified face. But the experience and memories and understandings could be different and diverse. So this is really a message I think you really vice versa into this community council and also for the global audience. So with that, we happily conclude today's session, and we thank Brother Mansa Bilal taking his time to share his life stories and his perspectives and his expertise about being a Muslim and in a racial and ethnic diversity background. And we hope you benefit from his sharing and his story, and we hope you can come to our platform more for the future talks. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.